welcome to the final Green Alliance webinar of 2024. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us. This webinar is going to be looking back at what has been a fairly dramatic year, I think, both in the UK but also internationally in politics and in terms of the climate and environment movement. And I am Holly Brazier Tope. I'm head of politics at Green Alliance, and I've got a wonderful panel of Green Alliance experts here joining us to talk about, the events of the year and how it's going to set us up for 2025. The panel includes Sarah Williams, who's head of strategic partnerships, Nick Davies, who's head of climate policy, Steve Coulter, head of economy, and Lydia Collas, who is head of natural environment at Green Alliance. I am going to go to each of our panelists for a few minutes intro to talk about their different areas of expertise and talk a little bit about what has happened this year, what does it mean, what are the biggest things that we should, be worried about for next year, and how are things looking. I'll then have a little bit of a discussion amongst the panelists, and I'll then open it out to a wider Q&A with all of you. So please do think about your questions as the webinar gets going, and put them in the chat, in the Q&A function rather, and I will be looking at them and collate them ready for when we go to the Q&A. So may as well kick off. I apologise in advance that I promised festive cheer and all I've got is tinsel and some guinea pigs dressed in Christmas outfits. But we'll see what we can do. So first, I just wanted to introduce Sarah Williams, who's head of strategic partnerships. Where are we in terms of politics, state of play? What's happening in the international context? What have you got?
Yeah, hi everyone. Great to see you on this year. Unfortunately, not a very festive background, but I'll try and improve that as we go. So actually, the start of the year was actually started fairly steadily, and in fact, the government's position on the environment had steadied since the previous autumn, where we had that net zero rollback. So I think increasingly from January onwards, we had much more focus on Labour's position, particularly around its spending commitments, which Nick, my colleague, will pick up in more detail earlier. So yeah. A couple of important events. The Northern Ireland Executive finally formed in February 2024 after nearly 2 years of delay, which is really great news. But basically, we're in that long campaign period for what felt like a pretty long time, to be honest, people focusing on sort of manifesto influencing. So it's actually pretty funny that people were quite surprised when the election was finally called. It caught a lot of people off guard. It was a couple of months earlier than people were anticipating. And so, yeah, we went straight into that election campaign, which featured, I guess, a surprising amount of Ed Davey in particular, but actually not that much of environmental issues. We saw obviously focus on things like sewage, for example, but actually environmental issues didn't feature quite so heavily in the campaign as I guess it could have done. But we did see Labour elected with a very large majority on a bold manifesto, particularly on climate policies. So just to really reinforce that, I think sometimes we've forgotten, but I mean, Labour's MPs total increased by 209. The Conservatives went down by 244, the Lib Dems up by 61. So there was such a big change, and we obviously had the 5 Reform UK MPs coming in, and then 4 Green MPs for the first time. So just a huge change. And in fact, 335 MPs were newly entering Parliament. There are a few more that were sort of rejoining after having lost their seats beforehand, but it was just an absolutely huge churn and a huge change. And actually, it then meant that it took some time really for sort of Parliament to sort of start again, for literally MPs to get offices, to get staff. So I think it's been quite a slow start in parliamentary terms. Government, though, just sort of kicked off with lots of things, which again, my colleagues will pick up in more detail in a bit. But I think we can just safely say that the first 100 days in particular was seen as pretty wobbly for the new government. There's a significant power struggle in number 10, which obviously in the end saw Morgan McSweeney take position as Chief of Staff. And the government made some pretty big decisions that went down, faced quite a big backlash. So obviously removing the winter fuel allowance and other things, which, yeah, will get picked up. So clearly quite willing to take on some quite difficult decisions and stick by them. We also had changes on the Conservative side, where they had quite an extended contest to become leader of the opposition, which eventually was won by Kemi Badenoch in November. She's self-described as a net zero skeptic, and we've absolutely seen increasing sort of calls from the Conservative Party, including people like Claire Coutinho now sort of attacking that sort of carbon budgets and some of the core climate architecture in the UK. So I think we're sort of entering into a new phase, perhaps sort of the end of the cross-party consensus on climate that we've enjoyed for many years. Despite, I think, whether people saw the YouGov poll last week, which saw that 63% of Conservative voters still being very favourable to environmentalism. So it's going to be an interesting challenge going into the new year. But yeah, I just thought I'd just end on the fact that we were absolutely not the only country to have had elections this year. I think it's nearly half of the global population voted. But obviously some were slightly more important for the work that we do in the UK and for our agenda in particular. I think those ones, unsurprisingly, was the European Parliament elections that happened in June, which saw right-wing populist parties make quite big gains. And obviously, we'll go on to talk about a lot more detail, I'm sure, it was the US election in November, seeing as the President-elect Trump win that one. So yeah, we can go into the detail under the Q&A, but I guess that's a whistle-stop tour of what happened in 2024, sort of from a general politics perspective.
And what a year it was. I think that was a really impressive summary of what has been a really dramatic year. And it's hard to believe that actually only half of it, more, 6 months of it was before the general election, because it feels like the election has very much been the focal point and what's happened since, which is a good point to bring in Green Alliance's head of climate, Nick Davies, to talk a little bit about what happened, when the government kind of hit the ground running, both in energy, transport, all sorts of things that matter to our agenda.
Thanks so much, Holly. Well, 2024 has been a real roller coaster year for climate policy. We started off in February with Labour downscaling its Green Prosperity Plan to invest £28 billion a year in home insulation, clean energy and industrial decarbonisation. And that pledge had originally been made in 2021 when interest rates were near zero. But as inflation and interest rates rocketed in since 2022, Labour was under increasing pressure over the fiscal implications of that plan, and it sort of head off those attacks by downscaling that quite dramatically, which was a bad start for our agenda in the year. But in March we had some good news that UK had now reached halfway to net zero. We cut our territorial emissions by 50% between 1990 and 2023. And although climate wasn't a big issue in the election, Labour did go in with some strong promises on its clean energy mission. And while overall the government had a bit of a wobbly start, the new Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary Ed Miliband really hit the ground running. He lifted the ban on onshore wind development. He approved some gigantic solar farms that had been stuck in the planning system, and he increased the available budget for clean energy projects in the government's next round of renewable energy guaranteed price auctions. And as if to demonstrate that clean energy mission is within reach, at the end of September, we saw the UK close its final coal power plant. That's making us the very first G7 country to phase out coal power. But that elation, I think, we saw in the climate movement from the election of a government that wanted to really push ahead on clean power was sort of dampened in November when we saw the climate denying Donald Trump elected as president in the US. And that, of course, cast a shadow over what was already proving to be a very chaotic and disappointing COP29. Keir Starmer, though, turned up at the summit and lifted the gloom somewhat by demonstrating some UK leadership and setting an ambitious, nationally determined contribution to cut UK emissions by 81% by 2035. And that set the bar high for other countries that need to set new NDCs in the run-up to COP30 in Brazil next year. As Sarah mentioned, in November, we also saw the election of Kemi Badenoch as a leader of the Conservative Party, and that has some big consequences for climate politics in the UK. Unlike Trump, Badenoch does not question the science of climate change, but does describe herself as a net zero skeptic, arguing that we shouldn't, why should we be spending money unilaterally reducing emissions when other countries may not be going as far? So that clearly has big political consequences. And one issue where we're seeing some of this sort of net zero skepticism perhaps play out at the moment is in the debate about the zero emission vehicle mandate. That's a real crucial policy in terms of decarbonising our transport sector, and that's now facing a big lobbying campaign with the government under pressure to weaken that regulation. But we've really ended the year on quite a high note with last week the government publishing its Clean Power Plan. That's the delivery plan for achieving its clean energy mission to make Britain a clean energy superpower and hit a clean energy on our grid by 2030. And in that plan, we're seeing really exciting moves from the government to unblock the bureaucratic grid delays that are holding up the deployment of clean energy projects. It's going to speed up planning decisions, and it's also increasing the budget for clean power projects in 2025. So 2025 is looking like it's going to be a bumper year for renewable energy.
Again, an enviable job. Well done for having summarised all of that. I mean, I think, much of this year has been waiting for the election, but even more of this year has been waiting for both the election and then the budget to find out what this government's priority is going to be. Which is a good time for me to bring in Steve Coulter, who is head of economy at Green Alliance, talk a little bit about, the government's green growth agenda and what happened in the budget.
Thanks a lot, Holly, and welcome everybody and seasonal greetings. Change of government, big change of economic policy. So much more about the state, public spending, public investment, industrial strategy, lots and lots of targets. And the core of this is something very welcome that we've been arguing for a long time, which is, as you mentioned, Holly, the green growth agenda. So Labour has a number of missions. Its most important one is growth. It also has a clean power mission, which is something we're very keen to see. I think the importance of the green growth agenda lies in the idea that not only are these two things not incompatible, so there's nothing incompatible between growth and net zero, but actually clean power reinforces the growth. So if you invest in clean power, renewable infrastructure, EVs, decarbonisation, this actually helps growth because this is economic activity. And this is stuff that we haven't really been doing enough of. So the UK as a country has underinvested in its infrastructure and capital spending for decades. And that's one of the prime reasons for our dismal productivity record and our low growth. So Labour's green growth agenda was very, very important for this, saying that actually by investing in net zero and heading for net zero, having ambitious plans, this is actually good for the economy. Having said that, I think the green growth agenda has taken a bit of a battering. I think we can go back to the budget for this. So the budget was a momentous event. We saw lots of good things, very sensible changes to the fiscal rules to allow more investment spending, and lots more investment, about 100 billion of extra capex over the course of the parliament. So good news ostensibly. Kind of went down a bit of a lead balloon. The OBR took a rather dim view of this. It pointed out that in its calculations, we won't actually see any growth from this extra spending until the next parliament, which is going to be possibly a bit too late for this government. And the growth in investment spending won't actually pay for itself for decades, partly because to pay for this extra spending on capex, the government had to hike taxes on businesses, on the private sector that it hopes will invest to reduce this growth gap. So the reaction of the bond markets was also a bit unpleasant. I mean, there was a brief storm right after the budget. That cleared pretty quickly, but I think it was a timely reminder that international markets do have some doubts about the fiscal probity and the sustainability of the government's finances in this country. So there were a few ructions, but the main thing is, I think, the fact that we won't see any growth from the capex for quite some time, I think did put a bit of a dent in the government's green growth agenda. I think there were lots of reasons for this. The rise in NICs I mentioned, the probably slower course of interest rate cuts because of the extra spending that's going into the economy. The fact that growth in the last 2 months has actually been negative, so we're not in recession territory yet, but we're certainly not sort of soaring ahead on all cylinders. So I think there was a bit of a concern that perhaps Labour focused a bit too much on the state and state spending, not enough about how the private sector will respond. So I think in the new year, I mean, the green growth agenda is not dead. It's certainly not dead. I think it does need resuscitation, and some things that could help would be a really good industrial strategy. We've heard a lot about the industrial strategy, like what we've seen so far in the green paper. You need to see a lot more sort of meat on the bones of this about exactly how the government will get the private sector to innovate and invest in the green economy. The National Wealth Fund, Great British Energy should help to convince investors that there's actually a plan and some money behind the green growth agenda. Interest rates will continue to fall a bit more slowly than they would have otherwise, but they will continue to fall. Once Trump takes over and we see a bit of clarity on what actually he intends to do, and often with Trump, it's not great, but actually it's not as bad once he gets going as you thought it's going to be. So that may help calm nerves in international markets. So we might see a pickup in trade, better relations with the EU, more traction with the EU single market. And also the sort of rise in public spending that we saw with the budget may start to filter through to the economy and see the growth picture improves. So yeah, green growth agenda in a bit of trouble, but it can come back. It can be resuscitated.
Great, thank you. Well, things to be excited about and things to be somewhat dubious about that have had a mixed reaction. And I think mixed reactions, it's a great time to come to Lydia Collas, who is Head of Natural Environment at Green Alliance. Obviously, it is quite famed that farmers have not been particularly happy over the last few months, but there is a lot more to farming and land use and water and all sorts of things than just talking about inheritance tax. So I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Holly. So I was thinking back to earlier in the year when the 28 billion Green Prosperity Plan was scrapped that Nick talked about. We'd hoped that would put some money into nature restoration. And so with that gone, it really felt like Labour had a weaker position on nature than the government at that time. So there was a moment in April when Labour did commit to delivering our legally binding target to halt nature's decline by 2030, and also to restore nature in our national parks and deliver our international commitment to protect 30% of land and sea for nature by 2030. And that felt like an important moment. It felt like the first time that they were really embracing the nature agenda. Since then, the most significant changes on, if we look to farming, came in the budget. There'd been a lot of speculation in the lead up that the farming budget would be cut. So that's what is paid out partly under the old system of area-based payments, which are being phased out in favour of payments for public goods on farms, which are being phased in, and that's critical for nature restoration. Actually, that budget was maintained with the biggest ever budget over the next couple of years for public goods to be bought from those farms, and with recent underspends rolled over. So 5 billion will be spent across this year and next in payments to farmers. But all of that was overshadowed by the decision in the budget to change inheritance tax rules on farms, as I'm sure everyone is aware of, where previously farmland was exempt. Now everything above a £1 million threshold is subject to 20% tax. Clearly, some were buying up farmland to avoid inheritance tax, and it's widely acknowledged that government does need to act on that. There's been a lot of debate about whether this change done in this way serves the desired outcome. And while some are quick to point out, really, it's a £3 million threshold, if you add in the other allowances and the 7-year rule applies, it's clear government are having to expend a lot of political capital defending this change, which raises a relatively small amount of money in the grand scheme of things. It's been a rough couple of weather years for farming. Certainly climate change is really showing itself, and we're seeing farms really embrace the environmental schemes as a way to de-risking their income, because that is a source of income that doesn't vary with the weather. But we are seeing drops in farm incomes because wet weather is just making production so challenging, and that will of course be influencing how the inheritance tax change is landing. So what we need to see are the broader supply chain reforms that could give farms a much better deal for their produce, and also for the supply chain to bear more of the responsibility for reducing the environmental costs of food production. And that's where it was really positive last week to see the announcement from Steve Reed that this government are going to redo our food strategy. It's clear we don't have the set of policies and regulations right now that are needed to make healthy, affordable food available for everyone, or to address the environmental costs of our food system. So we really welcome the opportunity to work with the government in developing that new food strategy, and hope that will be a place where those regulations on supply chain fairness for farmers are pulled through into that as well. Briefly on water, this was, as Holly said, particularly on sewage, this was a huge focus of the election campaign, both from Labour and the Lib Dems. The water bill that we have since seen this government introduce will block bonuses for bosses. It will enable criminal charges and create automatic fines for sewage releases. It's not on its own going to be the transformational thing that we need to sort out the terrible water quality across the country, not least because it doesn't create the conditions to deal with the pollution that's arising from farming, and it is essential that we get on top of that. So there's also a couple of reviews ongoing into water regulation, including the farming rules for water. So hopefully we might see some positive progress there, but we don't really know what's going to come out of those at present. So lots has happened, but still lots to do, essentially.
Lots has happened, but still lots to do, I feel, is a summary of pretty much everything on our agenda. Right, I'm just going to ask a couple of guiding questions for our wonderful panel before we come to a wider Q&A. I mean, obviously, all of our panelists have pretty much alluded in their opening remarks to the fact that the new government, it has not all been plain sailing. And, Starmer had to have a reset moment just a few months in last week, particularly on things like planning, farming, winter fuel payment decision. It has been highly controversial. So I just want to come to maybe Sarah and Nick first and kind of think a little bit about the missions and what they are to this government, and are they good enough? Are they going to work? Is it a different way of working that's going to work? Sarah, I'll come to you first.
Sure. I mean, sorry to jump to try and answer the question probably. I think it is still pretty early days, I think, to want to see whether missions do work sort of within government. But I do think it is helpful, particularly from our areas, to have this sort of cross-government focus on certain areas, and particularly to have that number 10 buy-in. Like, these are clearly core to number 10, to Keir Starmer, and delivering on them. He's like clearly very committed to it. I think, frankly, we've been relatively lucky to have a mission, perhaps I'd say the most developed mission, cover a lot of our agenda. And that's obviously the Clean Power mission, and sort of I think there's queries there about, there's a second part to that mission about accelerating sort of progress to meeting net zero. And I think that bit is perhaps slightly underdeveloped, although we're expecting obviously a lot of things happening in the new year. And I also think there's a broader question about sort of how our other environmental targets, particularly sort of the ones under the Environment Act and nature, how that has, whether that's sort of as ever not quite captured by this focus, and what that means. But I guess fundamentally, I'm never sure though how much of this is just a very Westminster focused thing. Like we've enjoyed talking about that. We've like been doing lots of briefings that align lots of stuff to the mission delivery. But I think following that reset speech, we now do have some clear milestones by which, in particular, we can hold government to account, and sort of the broader sort of Westminster facing movement. So yeah, slightly too soon to tell, I reckon. But as I said, I think having that number 10, the Prime Minister buy-in, is unsurprisingly very important.
Really interesting. I mean, Nick, I don't know if you just want to come back on, particularly on obviously some of the bits that aren't so obvious and they're not so easy in terms of navigating with the general public. I think a lot of the things we talk about are very Westminster focused, and they are very removed from people's everyday lives. But something that isn't is on planning reform and on housing and energy infrastructure. That's something that's really going to impact people's everyday lives and how they view the success of this government. Are you confident the missions will deliver?
Yeah, well, I think Sarah really hit on something very important there, which is that delivery between that difference between the delivery aspect of it. And I think I am quite confident that in the clean energy mission, we have got government has got a good plan, and I'm confident in the way it's approaching the delivery of that mission. But whether it cuts through with the public is another matter. So, clean energy mission is hugely ambitious, but Ed Miliband's put a really good team in place. He's appointed Chris Stark to head it up. And I think the government's going to, and they've published their delivery plan already last week. They've hit the ground running with a number of decisions. And I think the government's going to get a significant way to delivering that target by the end of the parliament. Even if it doesn't hit it exactly, we'll be hitting it very early into the 2030s. But is it cutting through with the public? We know that polling shows that policies on climate and clean energy are actually really popular. But I saw some polling when I was preparing for this webinar from I think from YouGov showing that a lot of people, when they're asked, they don't even realise that this government has actually taken a step up in what it's doing to deploy clean energy. So I think that's a big danger for the government, especially when other more easily understandable things like cutting the winter fuel allowance, which I think has been a big political misstep for the government. That's even though it's quite logical maybe for them to have done it, that's actually cut through. But is the clean energy mission actually reaching the public and beyond that sort of Westminster bubble that we probably all operate in to a degree? And I think another possible danger is the government's really choosing to frame that mission in the fact that it's going to reduce energy bills. And while it's true that our sky-high energy bills over the last few years have been really linked to the price of gas going up, and our exposure to that, it is a risky strategy because the very measures that the government's having to take to deliver the clean energy mission is actually going to put up green levies, which are being obviously added to energy bills. And this is going to place the risk of actually increasing energy bills in the short term. And I think that's going to be a target of political attack from the Conservatives and from reform, which the government needs to be really wary of. So I think just, to sort of close this up, I'm very confident in the government actually delivering its missions, and I think it is a great framework for actually sort of being a government that delivers something. And the clean energy mission is one of its most clearly defined of the missions that the government has set. But I think there is some political dangers there for the government, and it needs to make sure that it can show and demonstrate that the clean energy mission is really having benefits to households in terms of bringing down their bills eventually.
Right. I mean, a lot of those political dangers, I think, are new to this Labour government. Obviously, Labour have not been in power for 14 years, and this is all pretty new. And seeing the impact of some of their policies in such early stages has been a bit of a shock in a number of different things. So I just want to bring in Steve and Lydia to talk a bit about what they can do from here. So I think on the economy particularly, that they are trying to do a great many things, and you've touched on a number of the things that you would like to see. But I wonder if, Steve, you could just say a little bit more about how you think Rachel Reeves can get the green growth agenda back on track in the near term in a way that is going to impact, people's everyday lives. How is this going to cut through to the general public?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. Yeah, I mean, growth. I know not everybody in the environmental movement loves the idea of growth, but from the point of view of this government, many of the problems we have will be solved if we can get the economy growing, because that would generate tax revenues that it can put into reforming and improving public services, bringing down the debt, helping to sort out the NHS, revamping education, increasing defence spending. So Labour sees growth as the way to solve a lot of the problems that it's inherited. And I think, I was a bit down on the government, but let's not overlook the massive problems they have inherited. real per capita growth has essentially flatlined since the financial crisis. The headline figure is flattered by the fact that we've had lots of people coming into the country. So real growth has not really shifted. That means the public finances are increasingly indebted. We have very high labour inactivity. We have something like 3 million people who are not really participating in the labour market, which is a huge drain on the public finances. So let's not overlook the problems that Labour is trying to grapple with here. There's also the problem that its solution, which is sort of more investment and better targeted investment, is a very slow burner. It's something we haven't done enough of in previous decades. Even the extra investment splurge we saw in the budget will actually only stop investment falling as a percentage of GDP. It's not going to be transformational. It's very, very welcome, but it's actually only slowing the hemorrhage of investing in our physical infrastructure. So let's not overlook the problems. I think they do have 5 years, barring any other unforeseen scrapes. They do have time to turn this around. They do have time to invest in renewables, which will help bring people's bills down. The projects that the National Wealth Fund and GB Energy are going to bring online will create jobs. So things I think will start to turn around. What I think is lacking, well, I would be critical, is there's not enough about the private sector. It's always the problem when we swing between Labour and Conservatives. The Conservatives, it's all about the market. Labour tends to be all too much about the state. What I think we need is much more of an idea of a sort of partnership between state and private sector. So we have the sort of big splurge in investment spending, but we need to see how the private sector can react. I'm hoping there'll be more stuff on this in the industrial strategy. I think we also need some more attention given to tax strategies, how to incentivize employment, training, innovation, how to get our R&D up and running. You know, Britain's very, very good at inventing things. We're not very good at commercializing them. That's something the previous government struggled with. Labour has some new ideas. I'd like to see them. And things may improve, interest rates may come down, there may be less geopolitical uncertainty. We may repair trading links with the European Union. So I'm sort of saying, well, time will tell. You have a bit of time, the government has a bit of time. Let's see things start to work. But there are some things they can do in the meantime to really galvanize the private sector and get them investing and growing the economy.
I mean, time will tell. And Lydia, I think it is a good time to bring you in terms of using that political capital in different ways. And arguably, DEFRA have not used their political capital in the first months particularly wisely. People would say that's a Treasury decision, not a DEFRA one, but it has big implications for DEFRA as a department. I mean, do you think that there is still hope in terms of what they will seek to deliver in the coming months?
Yeah, I think certainly. I think there does need to be some kind of reset with farmers, whatever that looks like. But we almost every week at the moment there's a new invitation from government to participate in some co-created process to develop a new roadmap for farming policy that they want to do, as well as the food strategy, as well as a new focus on the uplands. So I think there are lots of spaces in which DEFRA are inviting stakeholders around the table to talk constructively about what to do about the other challenges that we need to overcome to make progress on reducing the environmental costs of the food system and improving the viability of farm businesses, particularly in the changing climate. I think what's clear when you look at what the scale of the challenges that we're facing, the amount of money currently in the farming budget to buy public goods from farmland is not enough. When research has been done into how much money is needed to deliver the improvements for nature, for climate, for water quality, and we know that the budget where it currently isn't big enough to do that. So there is going to need to be more money, and that's where we do need to look at where can private finance be brought into the schemes to supplement the public money that there currently is. And I think that's where we need to be looking, as the government is, at the water industry and reforming how regulations work there to enable money to go into nature-based solutions, whereas at the moment a lot of the investment from the water sector every year has to go into hard infrastructure rather than nature-based solutions. So I think that is something that they could do to bring much more money into supporting farmers to deliver environmental goods. I think we also need to look at the businesses up the supply chain that are the ones really profiting from the system that we have at the moment. There's no point putting all the costs onto farms that are struggling to make a profit year on year. So we need to look at how to make the supply chain more accountable for the environmental costs of production and bring more a fairer deal for farmers through that as well. I think the other thing that is worth mentioning is in terms of the general public, we know that there's huge interest in having more access to nature. People love green spaces and want more green spaces near their homes. And the water quality was talked about so much in the election because it was a really tangible thing that people could see the quality of the rivers and wanted them to be in a different state. So I think there's a really good case that government should be focusing on this because people are paying the cost of nature degradation, whether it's through the all the flooding that goes on year because of the way that we're managing land upstream, or through higher food prices because of climate change driving harvest failures, which are then driving up the cost. So I think that there are many ways that you can make a case that people will be better off if we put more attention on sorting out nature degradation in this parliament. I think we're yet to see anything that is really living up to that challenge from the government so far. And because farmers are so key to doing that, because they manage so much land, I think that's where it's really critical that we do see that reset in terms of relations, so that we can make really good progress on that in the next few years.
Great, thank you. I am going to come to some of the audience Q&A because we have so many questions in the chat and many of them are very interesting. So first I just want to start with, we've got a question on what tactics and strategy you would recommend for talking to Reform UK MPs and tackling the growing anti-net zero sentiment in general. And I just want to link that to something we alluded to in opening comments in terms of the international picture. Obviously we've got rise with the election of Donald Trump, but also the rise of kind of more right-wing populist governments that tend to be anti-net zero across the world. Where are we right now, and what does it mean for the Conservative Party that are trying to, kowtow to some of that further right reform thinking? Either Sarah or Nick, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I can briefly come in on that. Yeah, I mean, clearly the US election is going to be quite consequential in terms of the impact that it has on UK politics, and I think it is going to strengthen the hand of voices like Reform and the position of Kemi Badenoch being a net zero skeptic when you've got the US, the second biggest emitter in the world, going to pull out of the Paris Agreement, potentially going to pull out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's going to go for a drill, baby, drill approach. Action at the state level in the US will continue and the world will continue to take action through the Paris Agreement. But I think it is going to be a politically tricky time for the government. And I think it does need to really focus laser-like on being able to deliver economic benefits through the green agenda. So that industrial strategy that Steve mentioned, that needs to be really supporting, say, the UK manufacture of electric vehicles, so that we're not seeing net zero linked and decarbonisation linked to deindustrialisation. And we need to show that the clean energy mission is really delivering for households. So I think those are going to be some of the tactics I think the government needs to be able to use. I would also say that actually the majority of the public do get climate change and do understand that we need to act. So I think if the government also needs to not always be so transactional and actually do make the case for tackling climate change. And I think a lot of the public do want are maybe willing to come along with some of the decisions that need to be made if the government levels with them. So those are a couple of points that I would make in response to that.
Sarah, I don't know if you just want to come in on the reform point in particular and what you think the rise of reform means.
Well, I mean, just to follow on from Nick, I think sort of the way we communicate what we're trying to do, the benefits from what we're trying to do is just going to be really important. I mean, we need to be confident in how we engage with Reform UK, with the right, and we need to do that on a number of levels. Whether that's making sure that our policy proposals have like fairness, like at their heart. It's sort of the language that we're using. So that's sort of incumbent on us as well as the government to be showing how, what we're doing is really going to benefit people on the ground. And as you say, like it's a trend, unfortunately, that's happening across the globe. And we saw, I mean, I mentioned the EU earlier, but environmental politics there is certainly more polarized than it was before. They got the European Parliament was previously pushing for much more ambition, now like hugely more concerned about competitiveness. They have a simplification agenda, which people hear. We hear deregulation and we understand what that could potentially mean. So again, it's incumbent on us to be sort of reaching out and working with others to try and really make a sort of a very sort of meaningful, robust case on what we're doing, making sense across a huge number of different deliverables. So making sure that we're as confident as we can be to do that going forward, I think is going to be crucial.
Thank you very much. Lydia, I wonder if I could just come to you. There's a question in the chat about the fact that there's a lot of discussion on climate change, but it's something we've talked about a lot. Is there a massive risk that actually biodiversity and nature get lost with such a strong focus on net zero? And as part of that, if you can answer this as well, are you seeing any progress on local nature recovery strategies? The deadline is in spring next year. Where are we?
Sure. So I think it's not a focus on net zero that will mean that progress on biodiversity isn't made, because I think when we look at how do we get towards net zero, lots of the routes into that have benefits for nature as well in terms of creating woodland. We know that loads of woodland species are massively in decline, so the habitat creation that will go on towards net zero could have huge benefits on the nature agenda. And when we look at the businesses that farms are now embracing, I think it's become really clear this year. I've gone to lots of farms in the last couple of months, and it's really clear that the environmental schemes are what they're using to stabilize their incomes, and they're just forming such a crucial part of many farm businesses. And yes, this government needs to make major improvements on the environmental land management scheme, the farming policy that we have at the moment, to ensure that we are paying the right amounts for the right actions, so that we do make the changes that we need to happen. It's not currently in the best place, and won't currently deliver that nature target, in my opinion, at the present time. But if government can do that, then farmers are really embracing that, and I think we will see progress both on nature and net zero at the same time. Having said that, yes, I think we've heard that nature should be embedded across all of the missions, and but there's clearly no mission that really deals with nature up front. And so exactly where it fits in the priorities is sort of less clear. So I think we need to see, we just need to see those policies coming through that will make progress on that. I think you can't, in the way that Nick did with power and point to that mission and all the things that have fallen out of it, there's not the same story on seeing a plan for how we're going to reverse nature's decline, but there are some positive things. Like last week, for example, there was the announcement of the levy that will raise money through housing development to go into nature restoration, the exact name which I can't remember right now. On local nature recovery strategies, so there is some progress on these. This isn't something that I look at in a huge amount of detail, but I do know that the first one has now been published, so it is out there to look at. There certainly are. I've met some of the people that are involved in these, and they are working incredibly hard to do amazing strategies. But just where they fit into broader policy is unclear at the moment. So, for example, farming policy is entirely not connected to local nature recovery strategies, and presumably lots of the funding to go into some of the activities that local nature recovery strategies identify as wanting to happen will need to come through the farming budget and will take place on farmland. So I think looking at how they interact together and whether that's through landscape recovery projects, one of the bits of farming policy that enable bespoke agreements to be created, like that could be a way that they're more integrated. And the policy that could really make that integration happen is the land use framework, which would be on the list of things that we were promised this year that didn't come this year. Again, we've been promised it so many times. The land use framework should set out a spatial plan for how we're going to deliver our target to be just as self-sufficient in terms of food, as well as getting on track to net zero, addressing nature's decline. That should all be done in a land use framework that ideally should identify what are the policies, where's the funding coming from to deliver all of that. So I think if we could see progress on that next year, then that would really help the local nature recovery strategies to really have some impact.
Great, thank you. We've got a question in the chat that I would love to get the panel's thoughts on. It's how do we win over Keir and Rachel on nature and climate and give them more political space to be bolder and braver? I feel like Keir and Rachel would come back pretty strongly on that and say that, they've got a mission right at the heart of government. They would argue they're the most radical government in a long time to have this at such an important moment, etc. Do you think that we've won? Have we already won that argument, or is there still plenty to be done? Steve, is Rachel the first Green Chancellor?
At some point she said she was. I think that the trouble is, being in opposition is one thing. You can criticize the government from the sort of safety of the opposition benches. You can be a bit utopian in your thinking and sort of say to the public, oh, things would be so different if only we were in charge. And then when you get into power and then you collide with reality. I mean, I was at the Labour conference this year and so many people said the same thing, that the atmosphere was really weird. You're like, oh my God, we're here now. Now what? Is this it? And I think slowly the sort of the challenges of being in power were dawning on them. I think particularly with Rachel Reeves, I mean, the Treasury orthodoxy, a lot of people have complained about Treasury orthodoxy. Treasury doesn't like to think long term. Treasury hates industrial strategy. It's interfering in the market. Why on earth would you do that? Treasury likes to sort of do cost benefits for everything. Very hard to do cost benefits for nature preservation because, again, it's all a bit too far in the future. And how do you sort of quantify the benefits of sort of people walking in fresh air, even though there are mountains of scientific studies that show it's actually really good and it reduces health spending because it's really good for people. So I think as far as Rachel goes, there is this mountain of Treasury orthodoxy that she's having to fight against. There's also, as I mentioned, the sheer size of her in tray with all the economic and financial and legislative and international problems she has to cope with. I think give them a bit of time, give them a chance to get on top of things, give them a chance to sort of just lift their heads up for the next few months or longer than the next few months. And we might start to see some change. Having said that, events do tend to happen. They tend to pile up. So I think that's where we come in. We need to keep up the pressure, saying, look, you said you were going to be good. You said you were going to be green. We understand you have problems. Can we start seeing some results? Can you at least talk to us so we can point out the benefits of being green and following through on what you said you'd do?
Sarah, can I just come to you on whether you think the same for Keir Starmer? We've had lots of rhetoric recently on, the builders not bats and all sorts of very unhelpful things. I think the broader sector would say. Do you think that he gets it?
yeah, I mean, that's like hands up. That rhetoric is so unhelpful and unnecessary, and just doesn't fit with like actually how a lot of businesses now think about what regulation does and how they want to be partners of delivering environmental improvement. So I think we can just safely say, please stop using that language. I do think though the detail of things that are coming out, like we need to look through those and be a bit more open-minded, I guess, about what's coming and what the potential could be. I mean, as something that Steve just said, I mean, at a global level, climate and environment is dropping down the agenda of heads of state, global leaders. Like it's trade, it's security, it's the economy. Like that's all clearly dominating, right? And that is just the challenge that these people are sort of balancing. But then we did see Keir go to COP29, one of the major heads of state that did go, yes, that's climate again. But I think probably for Keir, like there's not that much. There's not probably not much difference in between. It's the environmental agenda, and he clearly wants to play a global leadership role. He did that. We've had David Lammy doing the same from the Foreign Office, which has been really great. And I guess it's just something also to reflect on in that how this government has been just a lot more open to its engagement with us, with wider civil society, and that is being really, really meaningful. So yeah, we can hopefully then go in and make the case, as Steve was saying, about how what we need to see, like why this works, like developing this civil society compact, which we haven't had for a while. Which yeah, and just starting this sort of a slightly different approach to engaging with broader stakeholders, which is really refreshing. And as I said, therefore it's then on us a bit as well to sort of keep making that political and electoral case for why action on our agenda matters, whether that yes, climate, nature, you name it. So I'm slightly more positive, I think, on this than others.
Channel the positivity. Let's keep it alive. Nick, I wonder if I can just come to you really quickly. We've got a question in the chat about the fact that there is a strong focus, rightly, on climate mitigation, but we really do need to increase our focus on adaptation and resilience. Do you agree?
Absolutely, and I think that's been becoming more apparent for quite a while now. We saw in 2022 UK hit 40 degrees temperatures record for the very first time. It was a record number of deaths that summer, forest fires, transport disruption, fires breaking out in London. So it's really apparent that climate change is no longer just something out in the future. It's something that's happening here, and it's affecting our lives now in serious ways and in sort of more sort of mundane ways. And the government, has under the Climate Change Act had a sort of governance framework for supposedly dealing with climate change adaptation, and we're up to our third national adaptation program now, which I think was launched a year ago by the previous government. But that document again is actually not fit for purpose. In the Climate Change Committee's last progress report on adaptation, they found that the government was not delivering adequate adaptation in any sector whatsoever. So I think it's a really important thing for the government to now start mainstreaming across its agenda. So when we're building these 1.5 million new homes that Labour have pledged to build, it's really important that those homes are built to be resilient to extreme heat, that they're built in a way that is not exacerbating flooding, that you may have sustainable urban drainage, so you're managing the water flow in developments and slowing the amount of water that's going into our drainage system. So there's all these kind of smart ways that we can tackle these issues and adapt to climate change. And actually many of them, they make our homes more comfortable to live in. They can boost wildlife if we have nature-based solutions to flooding and to drainage, and they can bring a wealth of benefits. And it's really about time the government mainstream that into policy. And I personally would like to see the National Adaptation Programme revisited by this government and redrawn out, because it really is not fit for purpose, the current one.
Great, thank you so much. Right, for the final 5 minutes, I'm going to do a quick fire and come to each of you. I would like you to I think one or the other, you can give me one of the big risks that you see coming in your area for next year, or one of the big opportunities. Show everyone whether you're a pessimist or an optimist. Right, Sarah, can we start with you?
Cool. For me, I will be optimistic. It's the hopefully improving UK-EU relationship. We've got a summit earlier in the new year, which should provide some clarity, hopefully at least on the UK side, about what it wants to get out of the sort of the big reset, which is it kicked off quite early doors. So that's just it's a huge opportunity to make some progress in an area which Steve mentioned has been being a bit of a drag for a long time. So I think that should be hopefully, fingers crossed, an area where we could see some improvements relatively quickly.
Right, Steve, you're going to channel that optimism?
Afraid not, Holly. Born pessimist. Also, just in case anybody else is optimistic, I think we need some sort of voice of doom to balance it all out. Yeah, I mean, I hope they can stick to their green growth agenda, but the economy may have other ideas. Other countries may have other ideas. On the optimistic side, we could see an end to conflict in the Middle East and Ukraine. We could see Donald Trump being less crazy than we fear he might be. On the other hand, none of that might happen, and we could see a recession. We're already seeing low economic growth or negative economic growth over the last 2 months. There are lots of risks in the global economy. And if we don't start seeing, a pickup in the UK economy quite soon, then I think nerves might start to fray, and I think there may be questions about the money being spent on net zero in nature, and when there are other priorities such as health and spending and welfare. And I could see the government losing their nerve. I hope they don't, but I think if the risks pile up on the economy, which is already quite precarious, I could see them possibly losing parts of their nerve, especially with the agenda of reform plugging away at their message that this is all a waste of money and we should be spending it on proper things. So I think they're acutely vulnerable to that narrative, and they need things to get quite sparkly quite soon.
All right, Nick, is that what 2025 looks like to you?
I'll hit a note on pessimism and optimism in the same one. So the big risk, I think, for the climate agenda and our ability to hit our next carbon budgets is the pressure at the moment that's being placed on the zero emission vehicle mandate. This policy is the single biggest carbon cutting policy the government has at the moment. Transport's the highest emitting sector. It's really essential that it resists the pressure that's coming from manufacturers and some areas of the press at the moment to weaken those regulations. It's got to maintain that ambition and make sure that the flexibilities in that policy are limited. And the government's going to be consulting on this soon. So this is a real live issue. The good news is that electric vehicle sales are ticking up very rapidly, and in November we saw a record new registrations of 25%, and at the same time petrol and diesel vehicles are being fewer petrol and diesel vehicles registered than ever before. But I think this is a big risk for next year. If the government wants to help, it should be helping manufacturers, and it can be doing that through the industrial strategy. But it's really important that zero emission vehicle mandate is kept in place.
Right, Lydia, you've got something positive very quickly.
Yeah, well, yeah, positive opportunity that they need to carefully take, which I think is the food strategy. Like, I think it is an enormous opportunity, and it was really heartening to hear how Keir Starmer, Wes Streeting, other government departments have really bought into this as well. And so for DEFRA, a department that often loses out, and in terms of what Steve was saying about, are we going to come under pressure on our agenda as there's calls to spend more elsewhere? A food strategy that delivers more healthy, affordable food for everyone, that like healthier diets also have less environmental impact. So I think there's a way to do that together and get ahead of that challenge that Steve was talking about more broadly in this space. So I think, yeah, it's enormously risky, but I hope that they can do it well and we can make progress on that.
Great. Well, thank you so much to my wonderful panel, and thank you for all of you for joining us. We're all ready for a break at Green Alliance. It's been a pretty hectic year, so I hope you all have a rest over the festive season and we can all come back rejuvenated in the new year. There's a lot still to be done. Thank you.